Klockan har slagit 12. Varmt välkomna till det här seminariet. Den här intervjun, man kallar det samtalet med Masha Gessen, och det kommer hållas på engelska. All over the globe, a strong force is growing from Duterte's Philippines to Donald Trump's America, from Putin's Russia to Orban's Hungary, from the British referendum on Brexit to our own Swedish election.
It's hard to find any political force or ideology with such a success and such confidence as the populist movement right now. As a matter of fact, it's hard to find any other political movement with success at all. Populism is gaining ground in almost every corner of the world. How do you criticize it without coming across as a tone-deaf elitist? And does populism always have to be considered a threat? Or are there any examples from the history or present where populists have played a positive role? These are some of the issues we'll discuss during this seminar. Please welcome world-famous journalist and activist Masha Gessen. You told me prior to this seminar you don't like the word populism. You'd rather use other terms.
Well, I think it's become a bit of a wastebasket term. I think we don't quite know what it means. It just means politics that we don't like. But there's also an undercurrent of, I think, a disdain for politics in the term populism, right? As though there was something wrong with trying to appeal to a broad audience, and as though there was something wrong with addressing the anxieties that drive people to the kind of leaders that we don't like. And I think that begins to answer the question of how do we talk about somebody like Donald Trump, or somebody like Viktor Orban, or somebody like Vladimir Putin, without condescending to the people who support them.
We'll get back to that aspect of this, but what word do you think is appropriate to describe a person like Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban?
A demagogue,
an
autocrat, an aspiring autocrat in the case of Donald Trump.
Are they also populists? Because as I understand you, populism there's nothing wrong with populism if you just talk about that specific term and as a political technique, but it's how it's used. Is that how I should understand you?
Well, define populism for me.
Well, that's hard.
Right, that's the problem.
Yeah, but if I try to put the question like this, in America, you told me populism has been somewhat positive sometimes.
I think the populist movement in the United States did have a positive influence on American politics.
Mm.
By the populist movement, I mean the actual populist movement that called itself the populist movement.
I see. You've talked a lot on this subject, although you maybe not use the word populist, demagogue or autocrat. Why does it interest you?
I wouldn't say that it interests me. I would say that I'm a political journalist who has spent many years working first in Putin's Russia and then in Donald Trump's America. I think I might prefer to write about other things, actually.
Okay. But history has forced you to be interested in this.
Well, again, I mean, I don't know that I'm interested in it as a phenomenon. I find both Putin and Trump profoundly uninteresting. Right? They don't have ideas. They only really have behaviors, which are much less interesting to engage with than ideas. So I would rather be writing about something else.
You referred to Putin as the man without a face, and you also referred to him as a small man, and I interpret that not only small in the terms of that he's not very tall, but also a small man in another sense. Do I interpret you right?
He is small-minded. He has, as I already said, he doesn't have ideas. And I think these are important things to understand, especially now that in a lot of the Western imagination, Putin is seen as some sort of brilliant mastermind of the plot against the West. And sure, he has declared war on Western democracy, but not because he's some sort of brilliant mastermind. And I think that sometimes that's really frightening to imagine that these men who can do so much damage are just dumb.
I've recently read your book from 2004, Esther and Rosie. It's the story of how your grandmothers managed to survive, as you put it, Hitler's war and Stalin's peace. How much is that book also a story of the consequences of demagogues and autocrats?
This is a book that just came out in Sweden, which makes me really happy that it's been translated here. And it's a book about my grandmothers living under a totalitarian regime. So in that sense, I don't know how useful, again, I'm sorry to be splitting hairs, but I don't know how useful it is to call totalitarianism, or to frame totalitarianism in terms of autocrats and demagogues, right? But I have written a lot about totalitarianism, both sort of the lived experience of people trying to be human beings with dignity and integrity, and a private world in a kind of society that aims to obliterate the private, which is very much a hallmark of totalitarianism. And I think that my grandmothers told great stories and set a great example of how that can be possible. But I've also written about totalitarianism in a sort of more
but
political sense.
This book was really interesting because both your grandmothers came across as survivors who had to compromise with exactly those values. You mentioned dignity and integrity, but maybe they managed after all, although they had a really hard time.
Well, it's interesting because when I was writing the book, I was really obsessed with the idea of choicelessness. I thought, what do people do? How do they make choices when there's no choice to be made? When there's so few options and all the options are bad. And now I'm actually much more interested in the same material, right? The same book, in reading it differently, in the sense that I think that actually insisting on making choices, even when all the options are bad, is a form of resistance, and it is a form of surviving as a human being.
Refuse being passive.
Refuse to be passive, exactly.
Hitler's 12 years in power led to World War II and the worst genocide in the human history. Is that experience from that period a help or a distraction when we try to figure out what the hell is going on now, as Trump put it?
I don't think that's a question that's possible to answer, right? Do we have the option of not having that be part of human history? So if we don't, then obviously we would be really stupid not to try to learn from it.
But it's being referred to very often as let us not make the same mistake over again, to close our eyes for this demagogue.
Well, don't you think that's a very good idea?
It is, but sometimes I'm not sure whether the comparison is right or not. I'm confused, and I'm sure many other people are as well.
Again, I don't think it's a question that's possible to answer for a simple logical reason. If the comparison is correct, and we as political people have learned our lesson, then the comparison will turn out to be incorrect. Right? If the lesson from history allows us to prevent a catastrophe, we will never fully know what's been prevented. And so the comparison will become invalid if we have learned the lesson.
Right. So when you put it that way, we are in Germany 1920 something, and maybe they could have acted differently, and all this would never have happened. Maybe. When you study the autocratic or populistic, as some people put it, movements of today, and compare them with the ones that were at place then in the 30s, when I try to do that, I see that the rhetoric was so vulgar then. Hitler said exactly what he wanted to do, and he got the people's support for it. The movements of today, many people sense that they say one thing, but they mean something else. Is that correct, my understanding of this?
I think that's probably more true in Sweden than it is in the United States. Donald Trump doesn't have much of a filter for what he says. His language is quite vulgar, and he has made explicitly racist comments. He has made horrifyingly offensive comments about people with disabilities. He has mocked a reporter with a disability quite visibly. So I think that we don't have sort of a euphemism issue in the United States.
I see. What do you think Trump is so honest in that sense that he tells his voters exactly his views and what he wants to do, or does he have another agenda, much more radical, that he would like to fulfill if he could?
How much more radical can you get?
I'm afraid you can get a lot more radical. I guess because the history tells us that there's no limits, really.
If we were talking about mass destruction, then actually I would have to argue with you, because Hitler didn't talk about annihilating the Jews.
Not in those words, but he was much more explicit than, for instance, Trump or.
He was explicit about his anti-Semitism, but not about the Holocaust wasn't planned.
No,
it was invented as time went on. And I think that's actually a useful thing to keep in mind, right? That hatred leads to more hatred and invention of the mechanisms of destruction. And I think that Trump's agenda, as he has laid it out, is radical. I mean, he ran on a platform of building the wall, right? He ran on an explicitly anti-Muslim platform. And he has been very consistent with closing the United States basically, at this point, entirely to refugees and asylum seekers, with instituting both restrictive but also just explicitly cruel, sadistic policies both at the border and inside the country in relationship to immigrants. Right? There's a concerted campaign of hatred and violence toward immigrants in the United States.
If we stay focused on Trump, what questions or emotions, or what issues or emotions is Donald Trump an answer to, you think?
Well, Donald Trump, as the President of the United States, isn't an answer to anything.
I thought you would say that.
But I think that people elected him for reasons, right? And I think that this is where I differ with some of my colleagues, or a lot of my colleagues in their analysis, where in a lot of American coverage of the election, there's this understanding or this implication that people were misinformed or they didn't know what they were doing. And I think it's condescending and it's short-sighted, right? Because I think that people knew what they were doing. It isn't the traditional sort of political science model of rational choice. But I think that for most people who voted for Donald Trump, voting for him was a rational act. And it was a rational act in relationship to the electoral system that has been entirely unresponsive to the needs of a great number of Americans who have seen their lives get worse, who have seen their future become more and more uncertain, who have seen the safety net just like develop these huge holes that led them through, who have behaved and voted for people who made promises to them and seen inequality grow, seen the rich get richer, seen that the system really only works for the wealthy and the highly educated. And I think that when Donald Trump came along, he basically said, okay, I'm the grenade you can throw at the system. And they did. And I think that that is a rational act. It will not improve people's lives, but it is an act of aggression toward the system that demands a response from the political system. And I think in that sense it's probably productive. Not good, but productive.
And the response from the political system, what do you have to say about that? When you see how it plays out now, the other parties, the Democrats, parts of the Republican Party that doesn't like Trump, how do they respond, I think?
Well, we don't actually see the part of the Republican Party that doesn't like Trump.
Paul Ryan?
Well, it's invisible.
Yeah,
right?
I agree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, the party has fallen in line behind Trump for reasons that are pragmatic and obvious. These senators and congressmen are running for re-election in districts that elected Trump, and their chances for re-election are lessened, I think, or at least they perceive that they're lessened if they don't support Trump. And they realize that his falling out of favor with Trump happens very publicly and can destroy political career. So I think that has exposed, in a way that we have never seen before, how the party system works in the United States. Right? And I hope at least that it causes Americans to think about whether the two-party system should be set in stone. I mean, it's something that I talk to my students a lot about, because they think that elections are a contest between two parties. And it takes a little bit of time to shake them up and say, wait, where does it say in the Constitution that it's a contest between two parties? So I'm hoping that we will have a broader conversation about the two-party system, about the way the elections work, about the Electoral College, perhaps even about the distribution of power and authority between cities, states, and the federal government in the United States. It's something that Americans have intended to for a very long time.
A common analysis when people try to understand why these movements are growing and politicians like Trump can be elected, they say similar things like you said, that the system or the parties that ruled before have failed the people. The richer get richer, or the wealthy get wealthier, and it doesn't have anything to offer to these people that you described that behave and work. So what should they change then? In all over Europe, these parties that haven't delivered what they promised to the people, if that's the case?
Well, actually, I'm not even sure what they're promising, right? And I think that's part of the problem, is that the business of promising, which is so much of what politics should be about, right? It's a negotiation about how we see our common future. I think that's a conversation. I mean, I know much less, obviously, about European politics than I know about American politics, but I know that there isn't a vision that comes from the Democratic Party. Right? Demagogues traffic in the imaginary past. Their message is always the message of, I'm going to take you back to an imaginary time when you felt secure, when you didn't experience these horrible anxieties about the future, about your children, about your retirement, about what the world looks like when you and people like you are no longer needed in the workforce. Right? So basically, Trump's promise is, you don't have to think about that. Make America Great Again is a promise to just take all of those horrible questions off the table and magically transport you to a time when you didn't have to think about them. And also a time when you didn't have to be confronted with people who are different from you, right? It's this idea that for white people in America, certainly it's an image of being surrounded by whiteness and not having to see brown people and black people and people who speak other languages and LGBT people. Just go back to total comfort. Not that time ever existed, but in their imagination of the past, it did. And in response to that, we don't hear anybody say, but wait a second, the future is beautiful. The future is glorious. The future is unknown and full of promise. And here are some ideas about what it might look like.
Can you see any politicians in the world right now that has that kind of approach?
I do. I do. Usually they're on the local level, but we have actually seen, and I think that a lot of the analysis of what we have seen electorally in the United States is a little bit wrong-headed, because we talk about it in terms of the emergence of the left, right? For the first time in generations, Americans locally are voting for people who identify as socialists, right? Which was something that was just like a word you couldn't even say. Right? Certainly, we saw that with the Bernie Sanders campaign. But I think the point is not so much that they're left, but the point is that the left has a vision of the future, right? And the message of the left, the far left, by American standards, far left, which is not far at all. The message is, society can be different, right? So it's, when Bernie Sanders was talking about very simple things like medical care for all and free college, which in America are radical ideas, that got people excited. Because it is actually specifically describing things that do not exist in the present, that would make life better and that can be imagined. Right? And so I think that we need a much bigger conversation about that, right? About a common future that is an improvement on the current state of affairs.
Could Bernie Sanders, would he have been able to beat Trump if he would have been instead of Hillary Clinton, be the one competing with Trump?
Look, I don't. First of all, how can we know?
I don't know.
We can't
Speculate.
Well, I can't speculate. All I can say is, look. I mean, first of all, Hillary Clinton got nearly 3 million votes more than Trump did. So even doing the calculus in the American elections, I mean, it's an absurd task, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trump won with 77,000 votes in 3 counties, which, that may sound like a bigger figure in a country like Sweden than it does in the United States, but it's a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket. It's almost a statistical error, right? Or within the range of a statistical error. So there's nothing meaningful we can say about that election. I think the meaningful part is that we have to contend with the fact that 62 million Americans voted for Trump, right? That's the meaningful part. And obviously we have to contend with the fact that he is not president of the United States. But talking about the election in terms of sort of the balance of strength as candidates is meaningless because it was decided by such a small margin.
Both you and I are representatives for the media, and at least in America, and I would say also in Europe, the media tend to come in an opposition role towards these politicians. In America, it's obvious, and Trump calls them the enemy of the people even, and the media sometimes have a problem to stand where they are and just do their job. At least he gets it his way. He manages to point them out as the enemy of the people. Could the media learn a lesson here, or should the media just keep on doing exactly what they're doing now?
There are many, many answers to that question, actually. And first of all, that doesn't describe all the media in the United States, right? I mean, there's Fox News, which is a hugely popular television channel that Trump likes very much, and which certainly does not hold an adversarial position toward his power. But I think that actually it is the role of the media to criticize authority. I mean, that's our job, right? And to challenge authority. I think that there are great things that have happened in American journalism since the Trump election. I think that there has been amazing investigative journalism. I think that actual new collaborative models have emerged. And that's very, very important, right? Things that are actually done differently than people have ever done in the past, right? Where there are different teams that work for, say, a team that works for a nonprofit foundation like ProPublica, which is an investigative journalism foundation, working with a team that works for a nonprofit radio station called WNYC, which is partly publicly funded. And then they come, they do an investigative report that's published by The New Yorker, which is a profit-driven company. So, you know, those models of research and publishing and crowdsourcing happen in different places and finding different audiences. That's new, and it's amazing, and it's partly spurred by the Trump election. At the same time, I think that we have also seen a kind of Trumpian drift in the mainstream media, where the authority of the office itself puts journalists in an impossible bind. Like, what do you do with a Trumpian tweet? Like, you can't ignore it, but you can't report on it either because it's insulting to your intelligence. And it's insulting to politics. But you have to, because he's the president. And that's, you know, that's an unsolvable problem. You can approach it better or worse, but ultimately it's an unsolvable problem. But I think there's another problem, which is probably not what you're asking me about, you know, in terms of how the media should comport ourselves. But I think we really have to think about whether entrusting the function of the media to profit-driven companies is a good idea. And I think this is something that is not part of the conversation in the United States. There have been these nonprofit companies that I have mentioned that have appeared, but they've still appeared sort of in the market context. But you know, a lot of the race between the Washington Post and the New York Times has been very productive, but a lot of it has been not very productive. And I think that the New York Times has made two major bad publishing decisions just in the last couple of weeks that were made because if the New York Times didn't publish these pieces, the Washington Post would have published them.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so the examples are very simple. What was it, 2 weeks ago, the New York Times published an anonymous op-ed piece by a member of the Trump administration. We don't know who, we don't know at what level, which is a huge problem, right? Because they called this person a senior member of the administration, or a senior official, but their standard of senior official is actually fairly broad, right? And so that distracts hugely from any information value that this piece has, because we don't know what the piece is about. Right? This person describes something, but because the author is anonymous, and also cannot be held to account, and also cannot, you know, it is the opposite of transparent, which is what the media should be. I don't think that piece should have been published.
At all?
At all. I think there might have been a news piece about an official coming to the New York Times and offering an op-ed piece. Right? I think that would have been a way to handle it. But I don't think it should have been published, and I'm convinced that it was published in part because if the New York Times hadn't published it, the Post would have published it. Or they thought it would.
There was another story about the Deputy
Yes.
General Attorney, it's called, right? Minister of Justice, Rod Rosenstein. And the story was that he tried to conspire against Trump.
Well, it's not even a story that he tried to conspire, right? So it's an anonymously sourced story about something that didn't happen. And I want that to be very clear, right? Basically, the story is that he considered the possibility of secretly recording conversations with Trump in order to aid in the invoking of the 25th Amendment, which is the amendment to the U.S. Constitution that allows the president to be removed.
If he's crazy.
No, that's not what it says. It says if he's unable to perform his duties as president. Right? So it's not, the intention of the 25th Amendment is not to remove a crazy president.
I see.
The intent was to, it was passed after the Kennedy assassination. And it was created for, if Kennedy hadn't died, but had been mentally and physically incapacitated by the assassination attempt, it was not clear what would have happened. Right? So that's what the 25th Amendment is for.
And that's what he maybe considered to maybe...
to maybe help other people in invoking. The problem again with that story is that it's an anonymously sourced story about something that didn't happen.
I see. Let's go back to the media. You mentioned the New York Times and Washington Post, and they have made some bad publishing decisions, you think, but they have also made a lot of good stories about Trump. They have scrutinized him. Anyway, it seems like it doesn't affect him. Why? He's still equally popular like he was when he was elected.
Well, he is popular among people who don't read the New York Times.
But don't they believe the New York Times, or don't they read it?
I think they don't read it. From what we know, they don't actually read the New York Times. And part of the reason that they don't read the New York Times is that they don't believe the New York Times. And here's something that I think, we, again, tend to talk about it in a way that just suggests, oh, these people are so stupid they don't believe the New York Times. Give me a reason why they should believe the New York Times. Have they seen themselves reflected in the New York Times? Has the New York Times written their stories in a way that that felt genuine and that didn't feel condescending, that didn't feel like a field report from the wilds of America? I don't think it has. I think that there are some, unfortunately, very good reasons why people who voted for Donald Trump don't believe the New York Times. And he has weaponized those reasons, and he has basically communicated to people that, look, you don't have to read the New York Times. I can communicate with you directly by tweet and give you the whole truth. And you can also watch Fox News if you so desire, but really all you have to do is read my tweets. There are structural reasons for why people don't see themselves reflected in the legacy media, and part of it is simply that the local papers are gone. Right? So the system of journalism that was in existence when I was growing up, where there were local papers and stories bubbled up through the local papers and into bigger papers, and there was a media ecosystem that reflected the local school board and the White House in some sort of proportion. Right? That's gone. That ecosystem has been destroyed.
But when I listen to you, what I hear is that you believe in this polarization between the ruling elite and the people down where the good behaviors that doesn't read the New York Times. Is that correct? Because when you look at who voted for Trump, there were a lot of rich people, a lot of wealthy people, and people with resources. Is there another truth to it as well?
I think that there's a lot of data on who voted for Trump.
Yeah.
But some of the interesting data, I think, have to do with not just the income levels, but the areas where these people live, right? If you're making a decent living, but you have a very well-founded fear that you're not going to be making it for long, and that your children are not going to be able to make a living, that's the biggest part, right? Then you're experiencing exactly what I described. And I think that the more people have to lose, the more anxiety they feel. The story about anxiety is not a story about people who live in poverty. Right? Poverty is a story of desperation. Anxiety is a story of people who actually have something to lose.
But the dichotomy between losers and winners, where the losers vote for the populists or autocrats, is that simplified in your view?
I think that people who vote for autocrats often feel that they're losing. Even if your statistical analysis might show that actually they benefit, right? But I think there's a sense of resentment. It's very much a politics of resentment, that something that should belong to them doesn't. And again, it's very easy to be dismissive of things like resentment and of the feeling of envy, right? We don't like it in ourselves, we don't like it in others. But especially in a society as unequal as the United States, I think it's wrong to write it off.
When you see how the world is developing with these autocratic movements growing all over, are you scared?
I really wish I were raising my children in a different world, yes.
Yeah. Well, was it better before? In the 50s or 60s or 70s?
That's a very hard question to answer. You ask a lot of speculative questions, and as a journalist, I am naturally resistant to answering any speculative questions. I think I would have had fun raising my kids in the 60s. I think it would have been interesting.
Yeah.
But how would I know? I've only read about it in books and seen movies.
I didn't live during the 60s either, but my image of the 60s is that there was this vision, there was an optimism which isn't really there now, which is strange because from many respects we have a better living now. Less people are poor, more people can get education and all those things, but still this pessimism.
Well, it doesn't help that the planet is about to fry up. And
you think that's an important issue?
Yes, I think it's an important issue.
Yeah. The globe is an important issue.
I also think again, anxiety isn't a function of what you have at the moment.
Mm.
Yes, on the whole, people live better than they have ever lived before in human history. But they also live with more inequality. Right? And I think that living with inequality is such an enormous source of stress for individuals and for societies. And such an enormous source of pessimism. I think that also, we live in a world with 15 million displaced people. How can we even live with that? Right? And how can we talk about what a good world we live in?
But if you dislike inequality so much, because you do, why is...
Wait, do you like inequality?
No, you seem to dislike it, and I
yes.
do as well, of course. But the question is this.
I didn't realize there could be a difference of opinion on inequality.
Why do you still want to live in America?
That is a fair question.
Thank you.
I'm a little tired of moving around.
Mm.
There certainly are more equal societies. Most societies in the world are more equal.
But when you moved to Russia, that's also very...
Well, when I moved to Russia, I moved to a country that was actually full of optimism at the time. Right? Now I've written a book about how misplaced that optimism was. But it felt like an incredibly exciting place. And it felt like a place that was really talking about the future. That's just the story about how dumb I am, and not a story about how to find the best country to live in. But my daughter has talked about living someplace else.
Sweden?
In Sweden,
Yeah.
among other places.
You're
I think
welcome.
that might be a very good idea.
Yeah.
Although Sweden is not really taking immigrants, is it?
Depends on who you compare it to. We're still more generous than many other countries. Yeah. So to wrap this up, if we should try to fight these movements, what should we do? The media, other politicians, you and I, as just citizens.
So politicians, that's the easy part. That's the one I actually already answered. I think vision for the future. Right? We have to be talking about the future, and we have to be talking about the future imaginatively. And stop taking things for granted and acting like there will always be the way they've been. It's also just such an ahistoric view. Journalists, I think that we have to be. We also have to re-examine the media model, and I think that is a job for journalists. It's a very hard job to do from inside the media, but there's no other place for it, right? But in covering them, we also have to be aware of the larger story at all times, right? Because especially with covering Trump, it's so easy to just focus on the thing of the moment. And to focus, for example, on the way he lies, not the way he lies, but the actual lie. Right? But when you focus on the actual lie, you also have to write the story of the way he lies. Because focusing on the actual lie is not enough. So always trying to write bigger stories, and that's so much more easily said than done. And I think that I fail to do that so much of the time. And then, I think, oh, I should have written about this in context and not just like fired off a column. And as individuals, I think we have to act.
How?
I think we have to, with others. The answer is with others. So not on social media, but out in the physical world with others. I don't think it matters what we do, right? Politics is what we create with other people. And it may be the school board, or it may be the playground, or it may be volunteering at an orphanage. But that is all politics.
So over again, make decisions, don't be passive.
Exactly.
Right. But there is also a risk if you interpret that as, for instance, going out and demonstrate. There is a polarization that is growing, and many people find it scary that this is growing and it's making these extremes even more extreme. So how do you act without being a part of that?
I don't know that that's actually a question, that's very productive. I mean, sometimes you want to be part of the polarization. Sometimes you want to stake out the other extreme. There are times, and I think, we're living through such a time when looking for consensus or looking for the center is immoral. There are some people that, you shouldn't look for a way to reach agreement.
But if you live in a democracy and other people think the center should be somewhere else than you and I think, how do you tackle that? It's still...
you argue for your position. You act in ways that don't augment evil. And I think that, we certainly have that situation in the United States where the center is shifting. And it's shifting in very disturbing directions. And I'll give you a very simple example, because we're talking in abstractions, right? But my experience of how the center has shifted is illustrated by this one conversation I had on American television, on MSNBC, which is a very liberal channel. And it was when the Trump administration was separating children from their families at the border. And the host asked me, he said, but they're portraying it as a deterrent. So is it working as a deterrent? Is it stopping people, preventing people from coming to the border? And I said, you can't ask that question. That's an immoral question. You can't ask whether this functions as a deterrent. He said, yes, I understand. But is it? And I said again, you can't answer that question. And there I was sitting there and I was thinking, this is horrible, I'm wasting my time on air. I'm wasting my time by refusing to answer the question, and it's also terrible for him because he is having this conversation about the question rather than an answer to the question. But I think it was a very important thing to do because that is resisting the shifting of the center, right? And we have to be mindful of that, but that's how things shift. And I think that you could also frame that exchange in terms of, oh, but wait, if we actually engage in a conversation of what the best way to stop people from coming to the border is, that would be a way of finding consensus. But I think that's a conversation that can't be had. And I think that there's political value in refusing to have that conversation.
Masha Gessen, journalist, activist, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much.